Well, with a bit of help from the commentaries and books on our bookshelves, we're going to unpack the story we read earlier. Now, Luke and Matthew are the only two gospel writers who explore what happened at Jesus' birth. They don't give the same details or emphases as each other, but they do agree that Jesus' parents were called Mary and Joseph, that he was born in Bethlehem during the reign of Herod the Great, and that he ended up in Nazareth, and that his mother was a virgin. Now, of course, there's no way to prove this. We haven't got any DNA testing from that time, so we're left with having to get our heads around a miraculous event. But as Jesus spent his adulthood fielding rather a lot of those, I don't see any reason to ignore this particular one. Besides, we know that Mary's cousin Elizabeth was too old to have children, and yet she was going to have a son, as we learned last week. So that was a miracle too. But she was respectably married. Not so for Mary. You see, Mary's a teenage girl from nowhere. And what happens here in this story is very likely going to cause a scandal which will hang over her for the whole of her life. She's a poor kid too, so that when her baby is safely born, she and her young husband only sacrificed 2 pigeons. So they obviously couldn't afford to sacrifice a sheep, which was the normal sacrifice after a birth. She's probably about 14 when the angel visits her. And as boys often married in their teens too, it's quite likely Joseph might also have been pretty young. Their marriage would have been arranged through an intermediary, and as soon as it happened, they were immediately viewed as being in a legally binding relationship, which could only be dissolved through divorce or death. The bride's family would provide the dowry, and eventually the marriage would be celebrated at the house of the groom's father. And the bride would be processed there and formally introduced into her husband's home, and then she'd live there with his family. But Mary is pregnant before the marriage, and so perhaps that big public ceremony had to be scaled down and rushed through. And in a small village, I think we could probably guarantee there would have been gossip. So Mary's a marked woman before really she's barely had time to be a girl. And she's cut off from all the normal hopes and dreams of girls her age, and she was in danger of being cut off from Joseph too. But Joseph married her anyway. He could have put her aside, hauled her before a public tribunal and taken her money because that was his right as the fiancé of somebody who appeared to be adulterous. But he doesn't. Instead, he takes the gossip on the chin, and he gives up the money and he makes Mary his wife. Because he knows as well as she does that that tiny bundle of cells which was growing in her womb is coming to save his people from their sins. And Mary's words when she first sees her cousin Elizabeth are full of hope and joy, because she knows that God has done something amazing for her, but also for the poor and the hungry. And she's absolutely convinced that God's promises which he had given to his people, to her people, so long ago, were finally coming to fulfillment. So together, Mary and Joseph left home for Bethlehem. And if we do the maths, it's likely they didn't come back to Nazareth for several years, as they made the dash to Egypt when danger threatened. So that meant they were cut off from everyone and everything that made them feel at home. And by the time they had to do that, Mary had already been warned that a sword would one day pierce her heart. And I think perhaps it's right that we don't forget that when Jesus was 12, she lost him for 3 days.
That must have been scary.
It must have been so scary. When he was 30, she, along with the rest of her family, thought he might be going mad. And when his ministry appeared to be coming to an end, she would have to endure the absolutely unimaginable horror of watching her son die on a cross. Well, that's not the end of the story, of course, but even after the resurrection, she would soon have to watch him being taken back to his true Father in heaven. And for her, that would mean she would not see him again for the rest of her life. And although it was a joyful time, I can't help wondering if it must have felt to her like something of a bereavement. Mary's path was always going to be very hard, and she must frequently have felt rootless and bereft.
Rootless and bereft, sometimes cut off from those closest to her, but not without hope. Because even as things threatened to unravel socially right at the very start, God gave Mary signs that he was very much at work in her life, restoring community even as she was cut off from home. As Pauline said, although Joseph contemplated cutting her adrift, and you'll find that story in Matthew chapter 1, an intervention from an angel in a dream persuaded him otherwise, and he stayed with her. Then, in the passage we read, one of Mary's first responses to the angel's awesome news that she would bear God's Son was to go and seek refuge with someone who might just understand and believe what was going on. Her relative Elizabeth, who in turn responds to Mary's arrival with a sort of prophetic delight at being in the presence of Mary and the unborn Jesus. Verse 42, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child you will bear." And so because of Elizabeth, far from being cut off by the social codes of the day, Elizabeth saw and affirmed Mary's place at the centre of community, not despite the circumstances she was in, not despite the child she was carrying, but because of the child she was carrying. And in doing so, if you go on to read the Magnificat, the wonderful song of praise that Mary responded with, Elizabeth encouraged Mary to believe that from that time onwards, every generation would call her blessed. Now that sounds like a full reinstatement to me. Once Jesus was born, this young girl who was supposed to be condemned and cut off received visits from rich and poor alike, from wise men and shepherds. And although Mary's life wasn't, in all probability, an easy one, from what little we read about her in the Gospels, we see that when this young family returned from Egypt, she was accepted back into day-to-day life in Nazareth. Indeed, actually, I don't think we ever read of her being in isolation again. Everything we read about her, she's in a group of people. We read in Luke 2 that when Jesus' family visited Jerusalem for the Passover, they did so in the company of other family and friends. At the start of Jesus' ministry, we know that Mary was invited to the wedding at Cana along with Jesus and his disciples. We know from Matthew chapter 13 and Mark chapter 6 that Jesus had at least 4 brothers and 2 sisters, if not more. Mary was blessed with the community of family around her. And despite their concerns at one stage that Jesus was losing the plot, this family group became part of the 120 believers gathering together as they awaited the gift of the Holy Spirit in Acts chapter 1. And in one of the most poignant accounts of Mary's life, in John chapter 19, the dying Jesus looks down from the cross, sees his mother and the disciple whom he loved, who's commonly believed to be John himself. And he said to them, "Woman, here is your son." and to John, "Here is your mother." After that, Mary went to live in John's home. So even at her point of deepest distress, at the moment of being cut off, or so it seemed, from her eldest son, God gave Mary an opportunity for community to be restored. I wonder, in these strange days where many of us feel cut off from community because of COVID restrictions, is God offering us new opportunities for it to be restored in some way? Or to be those who help to restore another person's sense of connectedness? Perhaps, like Joseph, to show that you believe in someone whose circumstances would normally only mean trouble. Or like Elizabeth, to offer that person a place of refuge and words of encouragement. Perhaps there are new ways of nurturing and sustaining family relationships. Pauline and I can't see our daughter and her family nearly as much as we'd like to at the moment, but we've been truly blessed by having our son and our daughter-in-law living with us over the last 5 months. That's brought some unexpected blessings to us. Or perhaps, like John, you have a role in offering the comfort of a place to call home and people to call family to someone who's in the midst of raw grief in bereavement. The only time that we seem to read of Mary on her own is when she had this amazing encounter with the angel Gabriel. It's then that she entered into the most priceless sort of community with God. And that's important because the whole reason that Jesus came was himself to restore our community with God, which has been cut off because of our sin. Jesus eventually went to the cross and experienced being cut off from his Father for himself, so that he could identify with us in our broken state. But he defeated death and he rose again so that we, in turn, could share new life with him in relationship with God who made us to live for him. All he asks us to do is to take the hand that he holds out to us in love and to walk with him, as Mary clearly learned to do.